They gave me the clipboard because I was no good for anything else. That's not me being modest. When the call went around the village that my brother hadn't come back from the reservoir, I drove out there too fast on the icy road and stood in the gravel lot at the boathouse with my hands shaking so badly that Gail, who runs the volunteer search team, took one look at me and decided I shouldn't be allowed near the water. She didn't say it like that. She has a kind way of moving people where she needs them. She put a clipboard in my hands and a high-visibility vest over my coat, and she said, "I need somebody steady on the check-in. Can you be steady for me?" I said yes. I wasn't steady. But the clipboard gave my hands something to hold, and the job gave my mind a wall to put between itself and the black water, so I took it, and that is how I came to be the one keeping the count. I should explain the count, because everything that happened inside it. When you search at night for a missing person, the most important thing, Gail said this twice, looking at me both times to make sure it landed, is that you never lose a searcher. The lake will take one person, and then it will take the people who come looking, and a panicked search becomes two tragedies instead of one. So there is a system, and the system is very simple, and it is the same whether you are searching a reservoir or a mountain or a stretch of motorway. Everyone who goes out signs out. Everyone who comes back signs in. And at regular intervals you count heads. You count the bodies physically standing in front of you, and you check that number against the board. And if the numbers don't match, you sound the horn and you pull everyone in until they do. The board was a whiteboard propped on an easel just inside the boathouse doors, under the strip light, names in 2 columns in Gail's blocky capitals. Out and in. My job was to stand at the folding table beside it with the clipboard, mark people in and out, and every half hour do a head count of whoever was on site between sweeps and make the 2 numbers agree. It is a job for a steady person, and I was not steady, but it turns out you can do a simple thing with shaking hands as long as you do it slowly, and I did it slowly, all night, and for most of the night the count was right. I want to be clear about that. The head count was right. Every half hour, on the half hour, I counted, and the bodies matched the board. 22 searchers when it was 22. 19 when a group went out and it dropped to 19. The arithmetic of it was the one solid thing in a night that had no bottom, and I held on to it the way you hold a railing in the dark. I counted people coming in off the shoreline with mud to their knees, and people coming down from the tree line, and the 2 dog handlers, and Gail, and the paramedics who sat in the warm cab of their ambulance with the doors open, and my mother, who would not go home, who sat in a plastic chair by the urn with her coat buttoned to the throat and her lips moving, and who I counted too, every time, because she was a body on the site, and the rule is you count everyone. The head count was right until I counted the reflections, and then it wasn't, and it never has been since. The boathouse has a wall of windows facing the water. In the day they'd give you the whole gray sweep of the reservoir, the far bank, the line of the dam. At night, with the strip light on inside and nothing but black outside, they did what all windows do at night. They became mirrors. They gave the room back to itself. I could stand at my table and see the whole interior reflected in the glass, doubled and slightly green, the easel, the urn, my mother in her chair, the searchers clustering and breaking apart, the steam off the coffee, all of it hanging out there over the invisible water like a second room built on the surface of the lake. I'd been looking at that reflection for hours without seeing it, the way you don't see your own hallway. It was just there. And then, sometime after 2 a.m, on a head count like all the others, I happened to do the count off the window instead of off the room. I don't know why. Maybe because the room was too close and too full of grief, and the reflection put a little distance on it. Made it a thing I could count instead of people I knew. I looked at the glass and I counted the heads in it. There was one more in the glass than there was in the room. I counted the room again. 16. I'd just brought a sweep and 16 was right. 16 matched the board. I counted the window. 17. I'm a careful counter. The clipboard had made me careful. I did it a third time, touching each one with my eyes. There's Gale by the easel, there's her reflection, there's the tall handler with the spaniel, there's my mother, there's hers, doubled and small and green. I went person by person, and every person in the room had exactly one reflection in the glass, and when I was finished, there was still one reflection left over, standing among the others. That did not belong to anybody in the room. It was over by the far end of the windows, a little apart from the cluster, where the glass met the corner. A figure in a searcher's vest, like all of us, head down. Still, in a room where everyone else was shifting and stamping and blowing on their hands. And wet. I could see, even at that distance, even green and faint, that it was wet through, that the high-vis vest was dark with water and clinging. And that water ran off it and was not making any puddle on the floor of the room that the reflection was a reflection of. I looked away from the glass, and at the corner of the actual room where the figure stood in the reflection, there was no one there. Here is the thing I keep coming back to, the thing I most want someone to understand. I did not scream, and I did not run, and I did not tell anyone. And I have asked myself 1,000 times since whether that was cowardice or whether some older part of me already understood the shape of what was happening and knew that the worst thing I could do was name it out loud in that room. What I did was tell myself I was tired. I had been awake for 20 hours. My brother was somewhere under that water or out in those trees, and I was running on coffee and terror and tired eyes and vent things. Everyone knows that the brain fills in faces and figures out of static and shadow. That is a real thing that real brains do. I held that explanation in both hands like the clipboard, and I made myself look back at the window to prove the figure wasn't there. It was still there, and it had lifted its head. I couldn't see the face. The reflection was too faint and too far, and the head torch on its forehead switched off like ours were when we came inside, through a little black bar across the brow. But I knew the set of the shoulders. I want to be careful because grief makes you see what you want, and I have spent a long time trying to separate what I genuinely recognized from what I needed to recognize. But I had spent my whole life walking behind those shoulders. Robbie always stood like that when he was in trouble and didn't want to say, head down, wait on one foot, like a kid waiting outside a headmaster's office. He'd stood like that at our father's grave. He'd stood like that the last time I saw him, 3 days before, in my kitchen, when he asked me for money again and I said no, not because I didn't have it, but because I was tired of the cycle of it, and he nodded and put his head down and stood exactly like that. And then he left, and I let him. I counted the reflections again. 17. The room had 16. And the 17th had my brother's stance, dripping water that fell into a lake that wasn't there. I went to find Gale. I'd decided in the cold logic that comes after the first shock that this was a safety matter, and that safety matters went to Gale, and that I would frame it carefully. Not as I have seen a ghost, but as I think my count is off, and I can't make it agree. That was true, anyway. My count was off. The board and the room agreed with each other. It was only the glass that disagreed with both. She was outside by the staging table with the radio. I told her the head count kept coming up 1 over when I checked it against the window. I tried to make it sound like a clipboard problem. She didn't laugh, and she didn't tell me I was tired. She went very still, the way the searchers who'd been on the team for years went still in the slow stretches, and she looked at me for a moment with an expression I have only seen a few times in my life and never want to see again, the expression of someone deciding how much of a true thing to tell you. Don't count off the windows, she said. Count off the floor. Bodies on the floor. That's the only count that means anything. She put her hand on my arm. Promise me you'll count off the floor. Gale, I said. Why is there one more in the glass? And she said the thing I have never been able to put down. She said it quietly, like a fact about the weather. Like something everyone in the village knew and nobody said. Because the lake keeps a copy, she said. It's been doing it as long as there's been a lake. Anyone it takes, it keeps a copy of, and the copy wants to be counted back. That's all it wants. It wants you to count it in. Don't. Her hand tightened. Whatever you see in that glass tonight, and you'll see somebody, love, I'm sorry. You of all people will see somebody. You do not count them in. You don't sign them in. You don't say their name to the board. The number that matters is the number on the floor. I asked her what happened if you counted them in. She looked out at the water for a while before she answered. Then the floor's one short, she said, and it's never the copy that goes to make it even. I went back inside. I want to describe the rest of it the way it actually happened. In the order it happened, because the order is the only thing that makes it bearable to think about. It didn't come at me, all at once. It came the way a tide comes, so slowly you can stand and watch it and tell yourself it isn't moving, until it's at your knees. First there was the signature. I'd left the board for 10 minutes, and when I came back there was a name in the in column that I had not written and that no one had signed, because we didn't sign the board. Only I wrote on it in marker from the clipboard. But there it was at the bottom of the in column, lower than my last entry, in a hand that was not Gale's blocky capitals and was not mine. It was wet. The marker had run, the way marker runs when the surface is damp, and the letters sagged and dripped a little toward the tray at the bottom of the easel, and they spelled my brother's name, and the loop he always put on the second letter of it, the loop our mother used to tell him off for because it made his name look like a child's, was there exactly as he made it. I wiped it off with the heel of my hand. It smeared green and gray across the white, and I rubbed it until there was nothing but a ghost of a smudge, and my hand was wet afterward, and it smelled of the reservoir, that flat, cold mineral smell of deep, still water, and I wiped my hand on my trousers and went on counting off the floor. 16. Then a sweep came in, and it was 20. I counted them on the floor, the way Gale told me, and did not look at the glass. But you cannot not look at a window. That's the cruelty of it. A dark window pulls your eye the way a cliff edge pulls your foot. And every time my eyes went to it, and they went to it, all night, no matter how I tried to keep them on the floor and the board, he was a little closer. Not walking. He never seemed to move, but each time I looked he had crossed some distance, from the far corner toward the middle of the glass, the way the moon crosses a sky you're not watching. The cluster of reflected searchers thinned and thickened as people came and went, and he stood among them now, in the body of the crowd, and the searchers' reflections did not seem to know he was there, did not turn to him or make room, and that was almost the worst part, the way the false room behaved, as if he were one of them and always had been. By 3:30, I could see his face. I'm not going to tell you he looked monstrous. He didn't. That's what I can't get people to understand on the rare occasions I've tried to tell this at all. He looked like my brother. He looked exactly like Robbie. Wet through and cold and tired, with his head torch dark on his brow and his hair plastered down and water on his lashes, and he was looking at me. Not at the room. At me, specifically, through the glass, the way you find one face in a crowd, because it's the face you've been looking for your whole life. And his expression was not anger, and it was not menace. It was hope. It was the careful, braced, frightened hope of someone who has asked for something they're not sure they'll be given, the same look he'd had in my kitchen 3 days before with his head down, asking for help I didn't give. He mouthed something. I couldn't hear it. There's no sound through a reflection, but I have replayed the shape of it 1,000 times, and I know what it was. It was count me. 2 words. Count me. And then, when I didn't, when I stood there with the marker in my hand and did not move, his face did something that I will be answering for the rest of my life. It didn't twist into rage. It just fell. The hope went out of it. Slow, the way hope actually goes out of a face, and he put his head down, and he stood there in the glass in his soaking vest, waiting. The way he'd waited outside every closed door of his life for someone to open it. And my mother got up out of her chair. I'd been so fixed on him that I hadn't watched her. She'd been quiet for an hour, lips moving, and I'd assumed she was praying, but I think now she'd been counting too, in her own way, the way mothers count, and I think she'd found him in the glass a long time before I understood she had. She got up and she walked toward the window with her coat buttoned to her throat and her arms a little out from her sides, and she said his name, his full name with the loop in it, out loud in the small bright room, and the reflection lifted its head. I understood everything in that moment, all at once, the way Gail had tried to warn me and couldn't quite. My mother was going to count him in. She was going to walk to the glass and say his name to it and reach for him, and the lake would take its copy back over the line into the room, and the floor would be one short, and it would not be the copy that went to make it even. It would be her. She would step into the place he stepped out of. The lake doesn't give. It only ever trades. And she'd have done it gladly, that's the thing. She'd have done it without a half-second's thought, walked into black water up to her eyes to bring him out, and called it a bargain, and called it mercy. I dropped the clipboard. I have never moved so fast in my life. I got between her and the window with my back to the glass, and I took her by both arms, and behind me I could feel him there. I could feel the cold coming off the glass like an open freezer, and my mother looked through me at her son, and her face was lit up with a joy that broke my heart in half, and she said, "He came back. Look, he came back." Let me, and tried to go around me, and I held her, and over her shoulder I said the only thing I could think of, the cruelest thing I have ever said, and the only true mercy I have ever managed. I said, "He's not on the floor, Mom. Count the floor. He's not on the floor." She fought me. I won't dress it up. My mother fought me to get to the window, and I held her, and I said it again and again. Count the floor. He's not on the floor. The one on the floor is the one that's real. Until something in her heard it, some part of her that had spent 60 years counting her children to make sure they were all home and accounted for, and that part of her really looked at the floor, at the room, at the absence of him in the room, and the joy went out of her the same slow way it had gone out of him, and she sagged in my arms and made a sound I will not try to describe, and I turned us both away from the glass so that neither of us was looking at it, and I held her while she shook. And behind us, I felt the cold go out of the window. I didn't watch it happen. I have always been glad I didn't watch it happen. But the freezer draft against my back warmed by degrees back to the ordinary chill of a boathouse in winter, and when I finally turned around, much later the glass held only the room. 16 searchers. The easel. The urn. My mother and me. Each of us with one reflection, and no more. The count was right. The head count was right. Off the floor and off the glass both, and it has been right every time I have checked it since, except that now I check it everywhere, all the time, for the rest of my life. They called the search at first light. They never found him. There was a theory about the sluice and the cold and how the reservoir doesn't always give back what it takes. And there was a small service later with no coffin, and my mother stood at the front of it with her lips moving, and I knew she was counting, and I stood beside her counting too, and we have never once spoken about the window. I don't think we ever will. I think it's the one thing we're each protecting the other from, the way she'd have stepped into the dark for him, and the way I stopped her, both of those being love, both of those being the same love pointed in opposite directions. I count reflections now. I can't not. It's the thing the night left in me, the way some people come back from a bad night with a limp. In any room with a dark window, any shop front, any car park puddle, any train carriage rushing through a tunnel so the glass goes black, I count the heads in the room and I count the heads in the glass, and I make them agree, and they almost always do. Almost. Every so often, not often, maybe twice a year, in some ordinary glass at some ordinary hour, the count comes up 1 over. And I know who it is before I find him. He's always a little apart, always head down, always wet with the water running off him into a floor that isn't there, waiting in his dark vest for someone to open the door he's been standing outside his whole life and the long, cold years since. I never count him in. I've gotten very good at not counting him in. I look at the floor, where the real ones are, and I hold the numbers steady. And I make myself walk away from the glass without saying his name, and it is the hardest thing I do, every single time, harder than anything, because he looks at me with that braced and terrible hope, and because 3 days before the lake took him, I had the chance to open a door for him, and I said no, not because I couldn't, but because I was tired of the asking. He's still asking. He'll ask forever, and I'll keep the count right forever, off the floor, off the only number that means anything. And I will go to my own grave knowing that the kindest and the cruelest thing I ever did were the same thing done with my back against the glass, telling my mother and telling myself the one fact the lake can't argue with. Count the floor. He's not on the floor. He never will be again. And I have to be the one who keeps not counting him, because I'm the one who taught him. That last cold day in my kitchen, that sometimes you can stand outside a door with your head down and your hand out, and the person on the other side who loves you, who would grieve you for the rest of their life, will still decide, for reasons that felt so small and so reasonable at the time, not to open it,